Mrs. Mary was at the peak of her 78 years and had experienced practically everything throughout her life, but something still left a void in her heart. She missed her dear granddaughter, Alice, very much. When the young woman last visited her about 4 months ago, Mrs. Mary complained about the lack of meetings between the two, who saw each other at most 3 times a year. Upon hearing this, Alice just reluctantly smiled and again offered her solution, that her grandmother move into her house. The young woman explained that this way, she would have closer hospitals in case of an emergency and also be nearer to civilization, since Mrs. Mary lived on her old farm, far from everything and everyone. But the elderly lady did not want to leave her hometown in any way. After all, she had spent her entire life there and it held all her history, making it nearly impossible to abandon her beloved home. However, Alice reprimanded her grandmother for behaving like a child and not appreciating her care and attention. "I just want what's best for you," she constantly repeated. But Mrs. Mary perfectly understood that Alice just wanted to sell the house her great-grandfather had built. For several years, the elderly woman heard such proposals but always refused, as she valued the memories of her home much more than the money she could earn. Alice had repeatedly said she would invest the money and the profitable business would benefit the whole family. This kind of discussion persisted for some years, but as time passed, the elderly woman realized she was too tired to resist the young woman's requests and that her granddaughter was the only family member still alive. Thus, to Alice's surprise, she finally agreed to move. The very next day, the granddaughter quickly gathered all the elderly woman's belongings and moved her to the city. The house was put up for sale, and it didn't take more than a month to sell to a couple, and with the real estate market booming, a large profit went into Alice's pockets, who decided to invest all the money without giving any part to her grandmother. In the first few months of living together, everything went well, but when Mrs. Mary met Alice's husband, she realized she had made one of the biggest mistakes of her life. The man lived in the same apartment and was always discontented with something, but above all, he was extremely annoyed by Mrs. Mary's presence and didn't even try to hide it. Alice tried to calm her husband, but this made him act more rudely and gruffly. The situation became so unbearable that the grandmother didn't even try to leave her room to avoid the displeasure of being seen by her granddaughter's husband. The elderly woman lived as if she were in a true hell, where she didn't feel comfortable eating her meals, watching her soap operas, or even sleeping and waking up whenever she wanted, being forced to adapt to a routine that wasn't hers. The worst part was that there was no way back. She was very upset, but the last thing she wanted was to bring discord to her granddaughter's family. If she had known beforehand that the young woman's husband would react this way to her presence, the elderly woman would never have left her house. Mrs. Mary had lived in her house all her life with her beloved husband John, who died 9 years ago from a heart attack. Initially, she handled household chores with some ease, but over the years, it became more difficult to perform tasks that were once so simple and cordial. Alice's parents, who died years before John when young Alice was only 13 years old, made the situation even more delicate. The elderly woman tried to give attention and love to her granddaughter but couldn't replace her parents, a fact that caused great discomfort in the woman. After finishing school, Alice went to the city and married the man who is her current husband and visited her grandparents very rarely, always giving excuses that she was busy with work. The granddaughter didn't even have time to say goodbye to her grandfather and also didn't attend the funeral because she was on a trip she claimed was for work. A year ago, she began visiting Mrs. Mary more frequently, and every time she offered for her to live with her and her family. Initially, Alice didn't hide the fact that she needed the money from the sale of the farmhouse because she needed to invest in her latest business venture, which the elderly woman didn't even know what it was about since she was always up to something new. To show how much she wanted her grandmother's house, she even promised to take care of her parents' graves from then on, something that had previously been the exclusive responsibility of the elderly woman. But now Mrs. Mary understood that they were just words and that she probably wouldn't do any of it. Her granddaughter didn't charge rent while the elderly woman lived in her house, but kept her pension money every month, claiming she would know how to spend it better than the elderly woman. "It's for your own good, Grandma," she said. Mrs. Mary remained sad and silent throughout this period, but it was as if Alice didn't notice what was happening with her own grandmother. To her, everything was normal. 2 years passed in daily, constant suffering. Every day Mrs. Mary prayed to her late husband to take her to him so she wouldn't suffer in this world anymore and finally find the peace and relief she so sought. But the elderly woman had no idea what awaited her, believing nothing could get worse than it already was. However, she was about to be surprised. One day, Alice told her that her husband's mother was very ill and it was difficult for the man to divide his time between the family and his mother, so they decided to move her into their apartment. The only problem was that there wasn't enough space in the apartment for everyone. When this was informed to Mrs. Mary, her granddaughter suggested that the elderly woman move to a nursing home since her husband's mother needed more attention and comfort. However, the elderly woman did not accept this. "You sold my house and now you want to send me to a nursing home?" she said to her granddaughter. Alice lost her patience upon hearing this and began saying she was just trying to help her grandmother. "You're just an ungrateful old woman who didn't appreciate the good things I did for you. If you don't want to leave my apartment, I suggest you move your clothes to the attic and settle there," said Alice energetically to Mrs. Mary, who, after hearing this, just gathered her clothes and looked for the nearest nursing home, promising herself that she would never set foot in that place again and that she never asked anyone for help, as she always managed to take care of herself alone. Mrs. Mary was so shocked by what she had heard that it was hard to believe Alice had actually said such terrible things. The young woman called a taxi for her grandmother, and they silently went to the nursing home. Alice left her at the gate and immediately left, saying a dry, "See you later, Grandma." A young nurse named Jane came to meet Mrs. Mary and, seeing the tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, told her comfortingly not to be sad because she would be well cared for there. During the first week, the elderly woman observed her new home and the people living there. She heard the stories of the older tenants and was saddened by the similarities to her own story and how she had ended up there in a very similar way. Despite this, she was very ashamed to be there and became increasingly withdrawn and unsocial. Many times, she watched her roommates' relatives come to visit her, always very cheerful, bringing gifts and sharing news. And when new cars stopped in front of the nursing home, her heart tightened and she felt a pain that hardly went away, imagining that more elderly people like her, probably rejected by their relatives, were arriving. One day, she was sitting outside on her favorite rocking chair in the nursing home's yard, where she liked to spend her afternoons. The autumn leaves were pleasantly falling at her feet when suddenly the same young nurse, Jane, who had comforted her on her arrival, approached her. "Hey, why are you out here and not having lunch? There's a wonderful chicken soup. I can even bring it here if you prefer. After all, having lunch with this beautiful view is better than listening to Mr. Wilson's repeated stories, isn't it?" said Jane, trying to amuse the tenant. Mrs. Mary smiled back and said she wasn't hungry. But Jane left and returned within 5 minutes with lunch. The smell was wonderful and everything looked so appetizing that Mrs. Mary couldn't resist and ate lunch. They sat there for about an hour talking about light subjects and reminiscing about good things. The elderly woman also briefly recounted how she had felt psychologically and verbally abused by her granddaughter, and when she thanked Jane for the delicious lunch and tea, the young woman promptly replied, "Relax, it was nothing. You know, I've been watching you for a long time, practically since day one, and please, pull yourself together and start living again because your life is not over. I see you've been sad since you arrived here, but there are always positives too. For example, I grew up in an orphanage. And after that, I came to work here. Do you know why? Mrs. Mary shook her head negatively, and the young woman continued, "It's because I'm loved here, just as you will be too. There are many good and kind people to talk to and live with here. And are you going to keep suffering for those who betrayed you? I believe you have a wonderful life ahead. In my case, I found a way to live for the benefit of others and take care of other people's grandparents. It's my choice, and I'm sure I'll work here all my life because you are my big family," finished young Jane with her speech. Mrs. Mary thanked her for the kind words, but was worried about the young woman, asking if she didn't think about getting married one day and starting her own family. "Do you think I'm going to get married? I have no education. I'm not pretty. I don't go to clubs, and I don't dress like other girls my age. In general, I rarely leave this place. So, there are few chances of me finding someone or having time for a relationship. Besides, I practically have no friends, and my parents were alcoholics. The truth, Mrs. Mary, is that the only difference between us is that you were betrayed at the end of your life, while I was at the beginning," Jane reported. The two women sat in silence for a while, looking away, thinking to themselves, and then Jane stood up, smiled, and, wishing Mrs. Mary a good day, left alone. After 4 years of living there, Mrs. Mary got used to her new life and, above all, was enjoying it. Jane was always with her, reading books, watching movies, and sharing the latest news. Besides, she also found friends among the same abandoned elderly people, and life no longer seemed joyless. One day, her granddaughter Alice, whom she hadn't seen all these years, unexpectedly came to her. Mrs. Mary noticed that the woman was more beautiful and well-groomed, indicating that her life was going well. When she asked how her grandmother was feeling, Mrs. Mary curtly replied that she could wipe the smile off her face because she wouldn't die anytime soon and that she had nothing left for her granddaughter to sell, saying Alice shouldn't waste her precious time with her. The granddaughter frowned and explained that she simply came to visit her grandmother. However, Mrs. Mary knew that no visit from Alice was without some hidden intention and, when pressed to tell the truth, she finally revealed, "I received a call from the bank and they said there was some problem. I tried to solve it, but they said only you could handle it. Is there any money we don't know about? Maybe some inheritance to receive?" Alice asked, not bothering to hide her true intentions in giving this news. Mrs. Mary didn't know until then, but all the money from the house sale that her granddaughter had invested had been lost, and she was nearing bankruptcy again. The young woman was just trying to maintain appearances. The elderly woman hadn't seen a penny of all that money, and now she would never see it. With that, Alice was hopeful that there might be a hidden card up her sleeve and receive more money through her grandmother. The elderly woman simply said there was nothing to be resolved and that her granddaughter could leave without looking back. "I've dealt with this before. It's just a debt your grandfather left," said Mrs. Mary to Alice, who, upon hearing this, left without a second thought. What the granddaughter didn't know was that the elderly woman was certain about what that bank call was about and that there was no debt at all. With her husband's sudden death and the lack of money to hire a good lawyer, all the savings the elderly man had in the bank had been frozen, and Mrs. Mary could never see that money. But now, everything was resolved, and she could finally withdraw the entire sum, with interest. She called the bank the next day and, besides getting the money, also discovered that her husband had inherited a house in the French countryside many years ago but never knew about it. Upon learning about this situation, Mrs. Mary knew exactly what to do and called for Jane desperately, who quickly responded and found the elderly woman. The elderly woman explained everything to the young woman and, in the end, said, "Listen carefully, young lady. I want to do this while I have strength and sanity. I will move to France, and you are very welcome to come with me. Take advantage of being a young woman with nothing holding you here and go live, gain new experiences, and meet amazing people. At the end of my life, I will leave my house to you and half of the money that remains. The rest of the money I will donate to this nursing home that I now love so much and where I found love and peace. If you say yes to my invitation, my lawyer will buy your ticket for tomorrow, which is the day of my departure. Take a few hours to think about it and let me know your decision as soon as possible. You deserve a chance to be happy," said Mrs. Mary emotionally while hugging Nurse Jane. However, the surprises wouldn't end there, and the elderly woman couldn't even imagine what was coming. The next day, her granddaughter, accompanied by her husband, decided to appear at the nursing home and make an unexpected surprise. Somehow, the couple discovered the money and inheritance and were flattering Mrs. Mary incredibly. Alice said her husband's mother was recovered, so her grandmother could move back to her house, telling her to immediately pack her things. "Oh, and don't worry about managing all that money from Grandpa or the house in France. I'll take care of all that for you. I just need you to sign here," said Alice, showing a document with more than 30 pages to Mrs. Mary. The elderly woman got up from the chair she was sitting on, pointed to a small suitcase on the floor, and said, "As you can see, my things are packed and I'm ready to go. But not to your house." The elderly woman finally said, "What you will receive is in an envelope on my bed. Take it, make good use of it, and we will never see each other again," said Mrs. Mary, picking up her suitcase and heading towards the nursing home's exit without saying goodbye. When Alice heard this, she didn't even look at her grandmother's face anymore. She was so eager to see a fat check inside that paper or some property deed that she didn't care about anything else, just grabbing it and cashing it at the nearest bank. She and her husband hurried through the nursing home's corridors towards the elderly woman's former room and, upon opening the envelope, the woman almost fell backward. There was no check or property deed, just a $20 bill and a postcard from France with a note on the back that said, "I hope this is enough for you to buy a new conscience." Alice was furious, tore up the whole package, and ran back towards the nursing home's entrance. But to her dismay, she only had time to see her grandmother and a young woman, who she later discovered was Jane, leaving with a driver in a black and robust car. After that, Mrs. Mary finally felt at peace, confident that no one would take advantage of her money, kindness, or innocence again. Jane had always been a great friend, even when she was at her lowest point. And now, she would be happy to help her in return. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and this other story that is now appearing on the screen will probably move you as well. Enjoy your session and see you in the next video.